We are in the midst of a survey study, really, of the book of Genesis right now. We're kind of not necessarily honing in on any particular details, but we're just kind of trying to look at that history as it unfolds. We're going to try in about 22 lessons worth, using some material that Jim Jonas had put out, to cover actually Genesis through Joshua in about 22 lessons. And so we're really kind of just looking at the history, moving through those major events in relationship to man, and kind of looking at it as a whole. And we're in lesson 4. If you have that in front of you, if you did not grab that ahead of time and you need a copy of that, just raise your hand and I can bring you a quick copy and I'll show it to you on the screen as well. But are they out back there in the back, by the way? All right, now fess up. Who grabbed it Wednesday and then didn't bring it back with them this morning? But anyway, I don't have a lot of these, so some of you are gonna have to look on the screen. You grab one, because I can send one that way and I'll send one down to you. Okay. Oh, you got one there? Okay. Anybody else? Bill, did you grab it? Did you see that? I saw your hand on it. You're good. Oh, I gave it to you. I'm sorry. All right. People at home wondering all they hear is a voice. See any face. There you go. All right. And I'll try to make, I'll think send one over, send that down the road there. All right. So remind me, I put lessons 4 through 6 out Wednesday. So apparently those got picked up. And so I'll throw another 5 and 6 out there tonight that you can grab for Wednesday night as we move forward. So here's lesson 4. And let's real quick, who do we start with in Genesis? Adam and Eve. And then what two characters kind of come onto the scene? Cain and Abel. Okay, when sin's introduced, how early? Really, really early, right? It relates to Adam and Eve and their first sin. But we really see how heinous sin becomes when you have Cain do what? It slays his brother, right? And so things progressively got more and more challenging over a period of time. Everything's not bad, but it got progressively worse by the time you get to whom in chapter 6? Noah. The imagination of man was evil continually, right? And so in that kind of, and we talk about this, that occurs because men begin to think in what way rather than spiritually. I'm kind of giving the answer away. Fleshly, right? They looked upon the women from fleshly eyes. They saw them as fair. They begin to think with their fleshly mind rather than a spiritual mind. And because of that, this progression towards greater sin occurs. God's going to do what? Yeah, right. He's going to deal with it. He's going to cleanse the earth. He's going to start over with Noah and his family. Then you move forward after Noah leaves the ark and his family. The world begins to repopulate. Same command, really, in many senses as you see with Adam and Eve. That begins to occur, and we reach about Genesis chapters 11 and 12, and we're dealing with what circumstance? Tower of Babel, right? Man elevates himself to such an extent that he's going to, in some senses, just kind of eliminate the need for God, and I'll just create this tower to heaven, and I'll be more powerful than him anyway. And so you've got this issue with it when it comes to man, and what's God do? Confuses their languages. He knows that if he can divide them up via language, that he can keep them from having this mindset that they can unify and be powerful because there's no distinction between them. And by the way, has that ended? No. Yeah. You wonder a little bit, right? And I'm not trying to... Yeah. And you don't, and you wonder at what point when God does certain things we don't know that he's doing in order to maintain what he originally intended. He did not intend for man to be able to bind himself completely together into one great big powerful thing where man begins to think he's greater than God. From the times of the Tower of Babel, he's always intended that man would have these language barriers and challenges that would create distinctions. And we talked a little bit about that when we arrived there. Who's the next character on the scene? Oh, don't stop me, Bob. I'll keep going. No, go ahead. I'm just kidding. Yeah. I don't know. I think it probably. No, I don't think it would be that yet. But yeah, I have to go look, Bob. I don't know the answer to that. So But that is a good question. So after the Tower of Babel, who's the next character? Abraham, right? Abraham, right? So Abraham comes on the scene, and what's God make with Abraham? Covenant promise, right? And then he's going to have a son eventually, and through that son, what's going to happen? Great nation. And we're going to learn today about multiple nations. We had last Wednesday, we didn't quite get to the point where he makes that covenant slight change, where he talks about, right now he just talks about great nation. Then when he reaffirms those covenants later, he'll begin to talk about this idea of many nations that will come. That's actually this lesson this morning, that eventually many nations will come through that seed of Abraham. Right. And so these initial promises of covenant that is made between God and Abraham. Abraham was where? In the Ur of Chaldees, right? And then he takes his father and his nephew to what location? Haran, right? Or Haran. And that city's named after whom? His brother, right? His younger brother, who is deceased at this point. And so they spend some time in Haran. We talked, I'm not going to rehash all that, but we talked Wednesday about there is some challenge between two narratives. If you remember what those narratives were in relationship to the timing of events. Yeah, what Moses writes in terms of the chronology of history in Genesis, and Stephen's kind of frustrated sermon that he presents before those who are about to stone him to death. There are some difficulties there. We spent more time probably chasing that than any other detail on Wednesday night about how Moses is focused on chronological history. Abraham was this age, and when this happened, and then these many years went by, and then this happened, and then Ishmael was this, right? We'll see that in this lesson. Stephen's just preaching a sermon about why are you doing this to me? And why are you following after those things? And so we talked about that. I don't want to rehash all that because we spent 20 or 25 minutes on that Wednesday night. And so, but there is this history now, this timeline of the life of Abraham. Now here's the point that I think we need to grasp. From the time the promise is made until the promise is fulfilled, about how long do you have? Now I'm talking about the initial promise, Abraham, I'm going to bless you. When does it actually occur in the life of Abraham? How long? About 25 years. He's about 75, right? Moses said he was 75 when he left Haran to head towards the promised land in Genesis chapter 12. But he's practically 100 when Isaac is finally born. So from the time God makes this covenant in Genesis 12 till the time period we're going to cover in our lesson this morning, there's about 25 years. How long have we been in human history from Adam to Abraham? We talked about that Wednesday. About 2,000 years. Okay, so from Genesis 1 to Genesis chapter 12, you're covering the first 2,000 years. So God doesn't really give us a lot of what about those first 2,000 years. There's not a lot of detailed information about those first 2,000 years. Main characters are introduced, individuals that God used for certain purposes. But keep in mind, one of the things we do learn in those genealogies is people live long time, right? Several 900-year-old folks, right? Adam sees how many generations? I can't even remember now. It's like 6 or 7, I think, or more generations that Adam was able to actually see because he lived that long. So, but that all changes. That time period changes. Here we are in Genesis chapter 16 is where we're going to pick up. Because there's a problem. And the problem is that Abraham and Sarah become what? Impatient. So we're roughly at this stage about how many years after they've left? Well, let me ask this. There's a question. Skip ahead a little bit if you're looking at your worksheets. There's a question. It's question 11. Okay, question 11 says, about how old was Ishmael when Sarah sent Hagar and him away? What was your answer to that? Okay, and there's roughly a time before they actually get sent completely away. Because remember, there's that initial fuss when she finds out she can see, but then she's brought back into the fold. But then it's later after Isaac comes on the scene that then Sarah's like, no, this ain't happening. They got to go, and Abraham sent. So there is a narrative that talks about how Ishmael shortly before Isaac is born, is about 13. And so I think by the time they're actually sent out, you're roughly 15. I think that was the argument of the writer of this worksheet, that you've got Ishmael roughly right before Isaac is born at 13. So if another year is gone, roughly a time period when they're sent out, he was roughly 15. So here's my point. So from the time Abraham leaves Haran and starts heading towards Canaan, 25 years before Isaac comes, at roughly the 20-year mark, I'm sorry, math is wrong there, at roughly the 10-year mark, they say, this ain't happening. We got to come up with a different plan. So roughly 10 years into this is when Abraham and Sarah begin to reevaluate and wonder, is this ever really going to happen? It took them 10 years and 10 years is in some senses a pretty patient amount of time. But God's testing them and working on their faith a little bit. But you're roughly 10 years from the time they've left Haran until the time that this occurs where Sarah decides, I'm not waiting any longer. We need to rush this, or we need to create our own methodology. And so what's she do? All right, so she gives Abraham her handmaid. This Egyptian handmaid by the name of Hagar here in Genesis chapter 16. And her logic in some ways is if you take faith out of the equation, is reasonable. Okay? If you're reasoning solely from human logic and understanding, and you've been childless for roughly how long up until the promise came? Right? From the promise time, 25 years from the time Isaac comes. So, and Sarah was about how old when Isaac came? Roughly 90, right? And so back up 25. So 25 minus 9, quick at math. So 65 years old, okay? At 65 years old, you're told you're going to have this child. Now I'm 75 years old, and that child still hasn't come. And in human logic and wisdom, I'm beginning to believe this isn't going to happen. Faith is here's the key to that. Faith is the only thing that's going to allow them to believe in this promise and stay convicted. Without faith, they use pure human logic, this isn't going to happen. I was 65 and childless. Now I'm 75 and childless. And she's convinced this promise isn't going to work through them. Got to find some other way. So she gives Abraham Hagar. And as bad as that sounds, from a faith standpoint and even from a wife standpoint as it relates to Sarah, who else is culpable here? Abraham. He could have said what? He said no. He could have said no. That's not what God intended. That's not the way this is supposed to happen. My faith is still committed to the promise and covenant of God that we will have a seed. Abraham could have said no. He's just as impatient as she is. So they circumvent the process. As they're dwelling there 10 years in the land of Canaan, and so she gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And so they have what? They have a child that comes from that relationship in verse 5. And the minute that happens, what occurs with Sarah? Okay, now isn't that interesting? Because wasn't the whole reason she gave Hagar to Abraham was so that they could have a child? You would have thought. So if she becomes jealous and angry and frustrated over that, then I don't want to be overly speculative here, but can we maybe argue that maybe that wasn't exactly what was, or if that was really what she wanted, was for him to end up with this child with Hagar, then why not embrace that when it occurs? Now maybe you can think, well, she's having second thoughts and she's right. Maybe that wasn't the thinking. Right? And so you've got those issues, which is going to be an issue when they send him away. Maybe she's testing Abraham. Maybe this isn't my problem. Maybe if Abraham has another wife and he still doesn't have any children, the problem is him, not me. But she can see. Now again, that's somewhat speculative because we don't know. But I've always been curious about the fact that the very thing you think she's intending is for, okay, take my handmaid, have a child, let's get on with this because this isn't happening. And by the way, culturally, as her maidservant, if she has a child, who's the child belong to? It belongs to Abraham and Sarah. And so I suppose you could have that kind of thinking going on here. Okay, Abraham and I aren't having children, but if I give him one of my maidservants, then the child will be as if it was ours. But it is interesting that the very thing you think she's intending is the very thing that she gets angry about when it happens. But it could be all kinds of emotional and all kinds of reasonings behind. Yeah, and I think it's and I agree with you. It's just curious that she becomes jealous and angry over the very thing that she set up and that she spurred and caused. And again, Abraham, as a smart man, would have probably said, he would have thought maybe he'd said no, but he didn't in that particular moment. So she's angry. She deals hardly with her, and so on this moment, Hagar does what? She leaves. That's right. She flees this scene because of the way Sarah treats her. She flees the scene, and so there's this challenge that becomes because of that. So the angel of the Lord finds her there in verse 7 and said to her, "Whence came thou, and whither wilt thou go?" And she said, "I flee from the face of my mistress Sarah." And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands." And the angel of the Lord said unto her, "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude." And so, though this wasn't God's plan, that Ishmael be the promised one, but yet through this angel we find out that he's going to what? God's going to bless them, right? They're going to multiply. They're going to have the benefit. That's right. And they will become a challenge. Notice verse 12 in the description of Ishmael. "And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." So this is going to be a problem from start to finish, and the descendants still creating problems. We're still fighting it. Still fighting against that long line of heritage and lineage. There's still conflicts coming from the lineage of Ishmael, and that's not a political statement so much as who's right and wrong. It's a statement of fact as it relates to what's happening still even in our world today in terms of conflict. And so it's amazing that these prophecies made as it relates to Ishmael are evidenced even literally in our world today. All right, any questions about that? I think we covered. So go back to question 1 then. I didn't talk about those as we went through because I kind of jumped around a little bit. But here's the birth of Ishmael. So true or false? Hagar's nationality made Ishmael half Canaanite. Right. And so the answer is false. That's correct. It's false. She was an Egyptian, and Abraham wasn't. So they were in Canaan, but she's described as an Egyptian as it relates to that. Discuss chapter 16, 4 and 5 in relation to the problems of concubines. I can't even say that word, but having concubines or multiple wives. How are these problems manifested in our own society? So there are still some religious factions that allow for polygamy, although that's a very small minority. The truth is, you don't have to have legalized polygamy in relationship to being able to have multiple wives to live a life where you have multiple women or men in your life. And so the disintegration of the family happened in those days and created problems. When you introduce more than what God intended when He said, man shall leave father and mother, back to Genesis, early Genesis, and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one. But what you have in these circumstances are 3, 4, 5, or in the case of men like Solomon, hundreds trying to be one, and it's a struggle and creates jealousies and difficulties and problems as it does for Abraham and Sarah, particularly in this initial situation that seemingly was cooperative. Yeah, in terms of the plan and the way God established those purposes. So again, you don't have to have full-out polygamy, legalized polygamy, to have the same problems of when the covenant bonds of marriage are broken or strained, and the difficulties that creates, not just, by the way, not just for the husband and wife in this circumstance, but who else is kind of going to reap the repercussions of some of this? These children. Okay, the difficulties that are going to come between Isaac and his heritage and Ishmael and his heritage, and all the difficulties that are going to arise from that. So the specifics might be slightly different. Same problems exist, though, when you do that. So how old was Abraham then when Ishmael was born? Okay, roughly 86, right? Roughly that age. Because he's about 13 when they conceive, so you can give or take a year or so there, because sometimes they talk about in the next year. Isaac would come. He didn't say in a year. They said within the next year. So you don't know whether that's exactly 9 months or how that works. But you're roughly in that ballpark where he's roughly 85, 86 years old when Ishmael comes on the scene, and he's going to be roughly 99 to 100 when Isaac is born later. Okay. Okay, thank you. I'd forgotten that there was an exacting. All right, so 13 more years passed then. And God eventually appears to Abraham to confirm the long-standing promises in Genesis 17. So, you see the promises are extended in Genesis 12. They're restated in Genesis 15. And now we're going to hear them again in Genesis chapter 17. So God continually is reminding Abraham through all of this time, okay, the impatience, the lack of faith at times, the struggles. He's reminding him continually about the covenants over the years. So God then appears to Abraham to confirm the long-standing promises. Let's look at Genesis chapter 17. Verse 1. When Abram was 90 years old and 9, so 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me, and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Okay, so now, that I believe Genesis 17 is the first time. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's the first time we see the multiple, the plurality. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to have a great heritage. Those are the things that are said in the earlier promises. I think Genesis 17 is the first time we see God when He's restating the promise in the covenant, where He says not just one great nation, but there are going to be many nations that come out from Him. And does that come true? Yeah, not just because there is a great nation that comes through Isaac, the nation of promise, but there's nations that come out of Ishmael, and then Abraham actually has what later? Other children with other wives that come up later. And so there are going to be lots of nations that come through Abraham. But this is the first time, I believe, that God mentions that within the promise confirmations. And you saw it. You see early promises made, and you don't see the land promise until later. And you don't see the many nations promise stated till later. And so the covenant that God's making with him and the promises associated with it expand as time comes and goes. Well, I mean, it doesn't necessarily. Just like Genesis chapter 20. The command is to walk before him and be thou perfect. And yet in chapter 20 is when he lies to Abimelech and has the consequences that result from that. That's the command and challenge. It doesn't mean that necessarily Abraham lived up to that standard every moment from that point forward. Bob, I'll be honest with you. I don't have a great answer to what appears to be the permissibility of multiple wives, because you don't necessarily see any condemnation of it, though you saw the original promise, and you almost, for whatever reason, you almost see this model, if you will, or this description of the way God wants things to be happen in the early book of, early in Genesis. But man kind of manipulates that over time. And then who kind of reestablishes and makes sure people knows, no, this is what God intended for that all along. Jesus does. So by the time Jesus comes on the scene thousands of years later, he has to kind of say, listen, over time, you all have done all kinds of things as it relates to marriage. You've done things as it relates to more wives than you should have had. You've done things as it relates to here's your writing of divorcement, get out. But Jesus then says, we're going back. And I want us to reestablish what God had intended from the beginning. I don't have a good answer, though, as to why there doesn't seem to be any kind of condemnation come down. Yeah. 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 And that's again, and that's what happens with Abimelech as well, by the way, in chapter 20 when you got that issue. But again, I don't have a positive or a exacting answer, except for the fact that apparently God chose to wink at that for a period of time, and then when Jesus comes on the scene, he reestablishes, listen, it's time to start honoring what God had originally said about marriage. Um, Right, you could, yeah, it wouldn't change, it doesn't change what Jesus said. Why God allowed for that doesn't seem to bring any harsh condemnation about it down over that span of time. It's really between God and those individuals and the plans and purposes God had. All we know is what Jesus said is now the law as it relates to it. And that's where our obligation to honor it is set. And I'll leave why God does certain things to Him. But I don't know. There may be a narrative somewhere that I just don't recalling off the top of my head that might give us clearer understanding of why He permits that. But He does.
In Malachi chapter 2, there's an admonition there about that, the altars being covered with tears, and about how a man should stay with the wife of his youth, and that it clothes your garment in violence to do this. So there are admonitions through there about one wife.
Yeah, I don't argue that. I think you're right. I think that there are definitely moments where there's warnings and challenges and reminders of the consequences that come when you don't honor what God originally intended. Um, and yet there's this permitted, or at least this non-strictly condemning approach towards that issue over particularly that Old Testament span of time.
Murder, he didn't permit
Yeah.
stealing.
Yeah.
It happens, and
Yeah.
he isn't going to
Yeah.
have everyone just
well,
because they broke his law.
Right, and I agree with that. I guess maybe my biggest struggle in relationship, and I think this is where Bob is on this too, is but he would deal with from a judgment standpoint, he would deal with a thief or a murderer. But this, he seems to still consider Abraham the father of the faithful, and yet that particular issue God allowed for him to have, even though he still considered him the father of the faithful. When you move forward.
Yeah, number 2, 12, he made a covenant. God never breaks his covenant.
Yeah.
To do so would break the covenant.
Right.
Liar.
That's true. So and I think there is some truth to that, as it relates specifically to Abraham anyway. That there are some covenants that are promises that are made that God's going to honor in some senses, regardless of how Abraham reacts. I think when you get into chapter 22 and you see the challenge of making him go out and offer Isaac up as sacrifice is kind of that final moment where he puts him and makes sure his faith and confidence is in the Creator. But that's always been a struggle too for me, Bob, to try to understand. On one side, God considers David a man after God's own heart, and yet that law seemed to not apply, for lack of a better description. And that situation's always been challenging.
Perfect is not necessarily without fault. Perfect is
Yeah.
When we think of our perfection, we're thinking of trying to be the perfection through Christ, but this speed completely.
Sure. All right, so let's answer, I guess, those questions real quick, 4, 5, and 6. As I sometimes get out ahead. But so how old was Abraham now? In Genesis says he's 99. And even in Abraham's old age, how does God expect him to live? And that's that description Bob just talked about, right? He wants him to be perfect and strive for that perfection. How would Abraham be the father of many nations? And if you skipped ahead to 25 and also looked at Romans 4, how's that going to happen? Yeah, he's going to have a lot of other. You're going to have other wives and a lot of other children that come about. And so because of that, it's not just going to be, Abraham's not just going to have a single heritage line that runs through Isaac that ultimately brings the seed promise, which is Jesus. But there are going to be all kinds of nations that are established because of these other wives and concubines and children that are born. Well, he makes it about, no, because I think he restates it, Bob, in chapter 17. Not to, yeah, right there, verse 6. when he changes his name in verse 5 from Abram to Abraham. Then in verse 6, I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee. And so he makes that promise to Abraham. Not nations. There's only one nation that comes through Isaac. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He makes a promise to Abraham here that there'll be multiple nations that rise out of his seed. You've already got two with just those first two. It's right. You've already got two with Ishmael and Isaac. But there's more and more coming. And when you look at chapter 25 and you see all those children that were born to different wives in chapter 25, and then you see that come to fruition as it's described by Paul in Romans chapter 4. Real quick now we're running out of time this morning, but look at Genesis chapter 17 and verse 17. So the promise is made to Abraham. Notice verse 15 actually. He says to Abraham, as for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt call her name, not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her. And so great things are going to occur through Sarah as well. This is the first time that you see Sarah included in the promises that are made unto Abraham. And Abraham says, he's 99 years old in verse 17. What's Abraham's response to that? Yeah, so they're still doubting all this. We're 25 years roughly removed from the time that these promises were originally made. It's not happened yet between Abraham and Sarah. And so Abraham says, no, let's use who? Let's just use Ishmael, okay? Why are we still having this conversation? That's Abraham's point. Why are we still having this conversation that Sarah and I are going to have this child? Let Ishmael be the one. But God says, no, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed. And thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And so Abraham's still begging, can we just move on from this idea that Sarah and I are going to have a child? I'm older than I was, and she's older than she was. It's been 25 years roughly, and we still don't have this child. Let's just use Ishmael and that heritage and be done. And that is not at all what God intended. All right, I got slowed down this time a little bit, so we'll have to come back and look at this a little more, because we've got to get to the birth of Isaac and the offering of Isaac. We'll look at those two aspects, Lord willing, on Wednesday, then go to lesson 5. I'll put more of those out this evening.